All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 16th, 1919, in the city of Boston, a massive cleanup effort is going on because the previous day, on the 15th, a large storage tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, sending a wave of molasses that rushed through the city streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour, killing 21 and injuring 150. As you know, sometimes in the intro right here, I add some other context or try to sell the story a little bit more, but I'm just going to read that line again because I think that's the best. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, sending a wave that rushed through the city streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour, killing 21 and injuring 150. Don't need to sell it anymore. This is the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, which, as the Boston Globe put it, turned the north end of the city into a scene of, quote, brown syrup and blood. Pretty incredible story. Here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Cara Giaimo, a science and history writer who wrote a great article about this for Atlas Obscura a couple years ago to mark the centennial in 2019. Also a Boston native. Cara, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And a Sherborne native.
Yeah.
Just had to pitch that.
All right, there you go. I want to get the details of this case, but did I read somewhere that the city of Boston smelled like molasses for like decades after this? Is that right?
That's definitely kind of part of the folk history, and it's something that I think some of the North End tour guides still say.
I could hear the skepticism.
You know, there was this moment back in the late 2000s when New York City suspiciously smelled of syrup all the time. And I wondered if it was just wafting down from Boston and the remnants of this great tragedy.
I was at WNYC at the time. This was a big story for about a week. It was straight. It ended up being the smell of fenugreek. I will never forget that name, fenugreek, and hearing Michael Bloomberg say that name over and over and over from a land in New Jersey. The nicest thing New Jersey has ever done for New York was to have a nice syrupy smell waft over the Upper West Side. Anyway, back to the molasses flood. Let's go through some of the details of the case because, as you hinted at, Cara, it has so much folklore around it. But at the heart, it's really kind of an incredible and tragic and really intense story. A lot of the sort of specific details seem to have been lost over time.
Yeah. So I think what struck me about it is, like, as a Boston native, like you mentioned, I had heard about it a bunch of times and sort of seen it presented as this weird bit of history that's almost like childlike because it's about candy. Someone I interviewed for the story described it as Willy Wonka-esque. But then if you actually think about what happened, it's horrible. It's like so gruesome. And it's also a story of infrastructural negligence and, you know, bad caretaking of a community that didn't have a lot of political power at the time. So it's really interesting once you kind of like crack open that sugary shell and get at what really happened.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is an industrial accident. It's, as you were describing it, Jody, the molasses moving 35 miles an hour, that's the speed of a car, and just huge waves of the substance smashing into buildings and into people. And there's something about the very viscous and sticky nature of molasses that thinking about how to get it off of you and how to extract yourself from it if you're caught in this flood, it actually turns into a pretty nightmarish scenario pretty quickly as soon as you start to think about it.
Yeah, this is not water, and I think that it's astonishing that the death toll was not higher. Because, I mean, molasses can also, depending on, it can be very hot, if you're boiling it or cooking sugar. It's a really dangerous process. I mean, I think back of the making of molasses all the way back to the slave trade, which was huge in the 17th and 18th century. And that labor was, a lot of people lost limbs or their lives trying to produce molasses for the slave trade.
Huh. And this was a huge industrial tank that burst, right? Which was really the precipitating event here. Cara, can you talk a little bit about some of the sort of first-person accounts or the stories of what it was like when this tank burst? Because it seems like the explosion of the tank itself caused harm, and then the molasses itself caused harm, and then there were knock-on. I mean, it was just sort of a tragedy that had several layers to it, it seems like.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a really weird day. It also had kind of a long build-up because, so basically the tank was built by United States Industrial Ammunition, which was an ammunition manufacturer. They had a plant in Cambridge where they made dynamite and other explosives that needed alcohol. So the molasses was actually being stored in the North End so that they could use the alcohol, or they could use they could send it to the distillery they had in Cambridge and use it to make dynamite for World War I. So they kind of had to build it really fast, or maybe they didn't have to, but they chose to build it really fast and kind of shoddily. And the people who were working on it were really afraid that this was going to happen. It wasn't a surprise. And the people in the neighborhood were very used to seeing it springing leaks. It actually sprung so many leaks that they painted it brown so that people wouldn't notice them quite as much. And so everybody kind of lived in fear of this huge tank. I'm sure the explosion was still very shocking, but it's just sort of seemed like the kind of thing that the community knew was dangerous but didn't have a way to do anything about. And so then on the day that it exploded, it basically had recently received a very large shipment, and it was fuller than it had ever been because it had already had some molasses in it, and then it got new molasses in it. And the kind of mixing of hot and cold started the fermentation process more quickly than it otherwise would have, and the gas built up. And yeah, it exploded, and pieces of the tank flew everywhere. And then the molasses kind of cascaded out surprisingly fast. I think it was the Boston Post was kind of the most poetic about their descriptions in the next day coverage. So they said that trolley cars were crushed like eggshells. A bunch of horses got stuck and just died. They compared them to flies on flypaper. A lot of buildings collapsed. A firehouse collapsed and trapped all the firefighters who were eating lunch and playing cards. One of them died. Kids died. Like houses crushed the people in them. You're right, Kelly. It is kind of surprising that only 21 people died. There are also like 150 injuries. But yeah, I think it was also just like the sort of nightmare waiting to happen, hanging over everybody's heads. And then everybody thought would happen did happen. There was a maintenance man named Isaac Gonzalez who was so afraid of it exploding that he would run and check on it at night when he had like a bad feeling.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so important because, I said earlier that it was an industrial accident, but it's neglect and it's not caring about it, not caring about the workers, not caring about the people who are around, and having this kind of ticking time bomb in the middle of the city and not having any way to do anything about it because there's not an occupational safety and health organization. There's not any sort of government entity yet that can focus on making workplaces safer. And it really has just become this major political issue in the early 20th century that you've had this rapid industrialization of the United States, and it's really dangerous. And at a certain point in time, somebody needs to do something to stop accidents like this from happening.
Yeah. The only thing that I can think of, and this is not the same, is when I was in grade school and it was the big oil spill off the coast of is it Alaska, the Valdez oil spill. And what you saw, like, you know, like ducks covered in oil and fish and whales and stuff like that. But this is just astounding because it's something that takes place on land, on the ground, and the visuals of it. I mean, I encourage like listeners to try to look up a picture of it. It's quite astounding.
I'm reading a book about the Johnstown flood right now, and we'll do an episode about that. But you know, it seems very similar. You know, it's like negligence, warning signs, and then just this total destruction on a number of fronts. And yeah, I'm looking at a photo right now of the north end of Boston, and it looks like, you know, the aftermath of a tornado or the aftermath of a flood. Can you describe, Cara, a little bit the north end, both geographically, but also the communities that live there, which I think get to Kellie's point about sort of whether there was the ability to advocate for safety or not?
Yeah, totally. So the North End is still sort of known as a place where a lot of Italian Americans live. Really good food. It's pretty densely populated still. It was super densely populated at the time. A lot of really like close together housing and narrow streets. At the time, most of the people who died in the accident were either Italian immigrants or Irish workers who were just at work, didn't even necessarily live there, but were doing the day-to-day tasks necessary to make the city run. One interesting thing for people who know the city now is that doctors, after the flood, set up a little field hospital in Haymarket, which is where there's still like a weekly market. And they were taking care of people there, like scooping molasses out of their nostrils and like trying to save people. So whenever I'm there now, I think about that and how different it must have been on that day.
And that's a big part of your article. You also did a great Twitter thread back when you wrote that piece, but, you know, about walking around in Boston and trying to see the signs of this that still linger. I couldn't tell, though, in the end, does it feel like the mark of this disaster is still there at the North End, or has it really been forgotten?
Well, I think it's like, yeah, it's a fun fact, right? I am actually really interested. It's not something I know that much about. There were a lot of legal repercussions to this event. Stephen Puleo, who wrote this incredible book called Dark Tide, which if you're interested in it, in the event, I totally recommend reading. It's really, really good. And it's very like quick read, and it taught me a lot. He talks about how this flood precipitated some of, like you said, the infrastructural protections that we now have, like building codes and making sure that the structures we have in our communities are safer. It was sort of without this flood, we might not have some of those protections now the way that we do. But in terms of, you know, traces, there's actually the Boston archaeologist and some other people who work in archaeology in the city found the foundation of the tank by scanning the ground. It's underneath what is now a baseball field, which is kind of cool. It's like the land is now being used for something fun. But, you know, there's not a lot of remembrance type plaques that are really detailed or serious. I think some people are working on this. One guy actually wanted to make a whole memorial in this parcel of land that the city was taking suggestions for what to do with, but I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. But I think more and more people are becoming interested in the event and what really happened and what it really means. So maybe we'll get a little bit more than just sort of like a one-off line in a tour, you know?
Well, it's fascinating that the markers of this event aren't plaques or memorials, but it's exactly what you were saying. It was the changes to industrial regulation, and it was also some legal changes. This resulted in one of the first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts, and it, you know, the people who sued were given a significant amount of money, about $7,000 per victim, which works out to about $100,000 in money today, and that type of class action lawsuit is really important for people injured or affected by companies because, you know, you don't have the resources as a single person to go up against a big corporation. But you do, as a group, have the ability to make an impact and get, if not quite justice, some sort of reparation.
Yeah. I mean, money is the apology, as they say in legal terms. But I wonder so much about, like, not just the legal aftermath, but the cleanup. Like, how do you clean up all of that? I mean, it's just astounding. I've said that before, but I can't get over, like, how you would clean that up. You can't just wait for rain to wash it away because molasses is really sticky, and I imagine it would be on everything.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about this. The one thing that comes to mind is that apparently the Boston Harbor was brown for like months because it just kept washing into it. But yeah, that's such a good question. There needs to be another book about that.
About the cleanup.
Yeah.
One other tidbit about the explosion itself and the sort of corporate malfeasance here. The company initially claimed, is this right, that the tank had been blown up by anarchists, which I guess, in 1919, that's just sort of your go-to.
That's right.
Anarchists did this, but wow, that struck me.
The Antifa of their day.
Exactly. Yeah. So as we wrap up, Cara, I'm curious, you said, this is a fun fact. This is a line that people use on a tour. And, no one talks about the Exxon Valdez as a fun fact. No one talks about the Johnstown flood as a fun fact. So is it simply the fact that this was molasses that has led this story to be thought of as like quirky and weird and fun fact as opposed to genuine tragedy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, I think, like you said, the fact that it was molasses makes people think of it as sort of silly and childlike. On the other hand, it's so weird that it was molasses rather than like, an ammunition factory exploded or like something else a little bit more expected, even though also awful, that it sticks in your mind. And so I think without the molasses aspect, it would just play a completely different role in history. And it does give people a chance to really learn about what happened. It's kind of that entry point that might not otherwise exist.
Yeah.
I was really struck rereading my own article in preparation for this talk because, when
that's a sign of good work.
Well, when I wrote it, the pandemic had not begun. And I was really I was going through my list of, because I took a day a couple of years ago and went and visited the graves of as many victims as I could because they're all buried around here. And I had a list of the victims and their jobs and all of that. And I was thinking about the pandemic and how so many of the people who have died have been sort of in frontline working positions or have been in really crowded communities. And I was like, oh man, I'm sure we learned from this disaster, but we're somehow in the same exact situation right now. Teamsters were dying because they were out there delivering stuff. It's the same exact thing. With this pandemic, we have delivery people putting themselves in danger every single day. And medics and doctors and nurses were having horrible experiences taking care of the dying. It's just it really struck me. That was kind of a new aspect of it that I hadn't had any reason to think about earlier. So it's kind of an interesting year and time to revisit this, I think, because of that.
And I think it's such a good point. And it also makes me think about something I've been thinking about with the frontline workers and these last couple of years where there's just the power of telling those stories and being honest about what's going on. And so much is just about what's hidden and what we don't see and how stories get glossed over, manipulated, or not told. And so this feels like an example of just if you see it for what it is, then that's the first step and you start to really understand what it means. So we will link to that piece for sure in the show notes to this, and we'll tweet it out, and people should go read that. And certainly if you are in Boston, tell us if you see any more of those plaques floating around or anything like that. I think, part because of this article and all of the centennial and so forth, there is a little more attention being paid, as you said. But Cara Giaimo, thank you so much for doing this, and go check out the piece that she wrote for Atlas Obscura.
Thank you all so much.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. If you'd like to support the show and the network directly, you can do so at our website, thisdaypod.org. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts. Special thanks to Julie Shapiro and Audrey Murdovich, executive producers at Radiotopia, and special thanks to the whole team at Radiotopia and PRX. Get in touch if you have any questions or comments or ideas for topics on the show or special guests that you would like us to have on. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. On our website, you can also get full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social media at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. This is my obligatory please rate and review us in your favorite podcast app, or better yet, just tell a friend about the show. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From P